On the sunny afternoon of March 12, 2023, the city of Denver, Colorado, seemed to be in perfect harmony. The gentle wind and clear sky created an idyllic setting, contrasting with the turmoil unfolding inside the Harris home. Mark and Emily Harris, a well-established couple, were known in the local community for their successful and happy appearance. Mark, an executive at a renowned technology company, was respected for his dedication and competence at work. Emily, a freelance artist, had a knack for capturing the essence of beauty in her works, earning her the admiration of many. That afternoon, while Mark was in his home office, Emily was busy preparing a light lunch in the kitchen. The house was quiet, but there was a tension in the air that Emily couldn't quite identify. Mark, normally reserved, was particularly agitated and distracted. His thoughts were far from the daily routine, focused on a new interest that had taken over his mind. Over the past few months, Mark had begun to explore new sexual fantasies, something he occasionally shared with Emily. At first, it was just superficial conversations and light suggestions, which Emily was willing to try to keep the spark in their relationship burning. But over time, the fantasies began to become more specific and detailed. That afternoon, Mark decided to share a new idea with Emily. He found her in the kitchen while she was serving lunch. With a nervous smile, he tried to introduce the new scenario he had created into his mind. "Emily, I have a new fantasy I'd like to explore," Mark said, trying to keep his tone casual, but with an expression of anxiety that didn't go unnoticed by Emily. She raised an eyebrow and smiled, trying to hide her concern. "Oh, and what is it this time?" Mark began to describe a complex scenario, involving detailed roles and scenarios that he wanted Emily to play. The idea was a sexual fantasy game that included role-playing and power dynamics that seemed increasingly extreme. Emily listened intently, but her expression gradually changed from interest to discomfort. She realized that the fantasy was moving away from what she considered acceptable and healthy for their relationship. Mark was more animated than ever, describing the details with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "Mark, this feels a little more intense than what we're used to," Emily commented, trying to remain calm. "I don't know if I'm comfortable with those details." Mark, however, reacted impatiently. "Can't you just try? It's just a game, Emily. I just want you to be more involved. That's important to me." Emily tried to voice her concerns, but Mark didn't seem willing to listen. He was obsessed with the idea and increasingly determined to carry out the fantasy without considering Emily's limits and feelings. Over the next few days, Mark continued to press the topic, pressuring Emily to participate and play roles that she found uncomfortable. Mark's behavior began to change, becoming more demanding and controlling. He spent hours in his home office, planning the details of his fantasies and neglecting his daily responsibilities. Emily felt like her life was being invaded by Mark's new obsession. She was trying to maintain the relationship, but the pressure and discomfort were becoming unbearable. Talk about their fantasies began to dominate their interactions, and their relationship, which was once based on love and mutual respect, was deteriorating under the weight of Mark's obsession. On March 12th, Emily found herself reflecting on how everything had changed. What began as an attempt to explore new dimensions of their relationship had now turned into an emotional battlefield. Mark was completely immersed in his fantasies, and Emily was increasingly worried about what the future held. Emily was on the verge of an emotional breakdown, and Mark's obsession was beginning to take over their lives in ways she couldn't control. What seemed like a simple fantasy was about to trigger a series of events that would change their lives forever. As April began, the tension in the Harris household had reached a new level. The atmosphere between Mark and Emily was filled with palpable anxiety, and what had started as a fantasy game was now turning into something darker and more disturbing. Mark, increasingly obsessed, immersed himself in his fantasy scenarios with an almost manic intensity. He spent hours in his home office, where he had transformed the space into a planning center for his fantasies. Scattered papers, notes, and books on psychology and power dynamics were everywhere. The space was permeated with an unsettling sense of control and obsessive planning. Emily, on the other hand, found herself struggling to maintain calm and normalcy in her life. He tried to keep his artistic career going, but the constant worry about the situation at home was affecting his work and well-being. She had tried to seek comfort from friends and family, but was reluctant to share too many details for fear of backlash and possible repercussions. Dates between Mark and Emily began to become increasingly tense and uncomfortable. Not only did Mark insist on exploring his fantasies, he also began demanding that Emily follow strict rules and increasingly extreme details. His requests became more specific and invasive, leading to increasing discomfort on Emily's part. On April 2nd, during a night when Emily was trying to relax in the living room, Mark walked in with a determined look and a notebook full of notes. "Emily, I need you to understand the importance of following the exact details. This is how this is going to work," he said, his tone firm and insistent. Emily, trying to remain calm, replied, "Mark, I've told you before that this is making me uncomfortable. I don't know if I can go through with this." Mark was irritated. "You don't understand, Emily. This is crucial to me. If you're not willing to do this, then you're not committed to our relationship." The confrontation was intense. Mark accused Emily of not trying hard enough and not being supportive of his needs. Emily, in turn, felt trapped and pressured, with the feeling that any resistance she offered would be interpreted as a failure in the relationship. Mark's obsession was starting to have a direct impact on his daily routine. He neglected his work, spent less time with friends and family, and was increasingly isolated. The obsession was taking over every aspect of his life, and he didn't seem to realize the magnitude of the problem. The situation became even more serious when Mark began rehearsing and testing fantasy scenarios alone, demonstrating increasingly erratic behavior. He spent nights awake, immersed in his fantasies, and his behavior began to affect his performance at work. Coworkers and friends noticed the change in his attitude, but Mark was so absorbed in his obsession that he didn't care about the external consequences. Emily tried to seek help outside the home. She began seeing a therapist, but kept the situation at home a secret to avoid further alarming those around her. Therapy helped, but Emily felt increasingly desperate, not knowing how to stop the cycle of obsession and control that Mark had created. Tensions came to a head on the weekend of April 4th when Mark introduced a new scenario to Emily. It was an elaborate plan that involved simulations of violence and submission, far beyond the limits Emily was willing to tolerate. She tried to refuse again, but Mark was intransigent. "It's just an act," Mark insisted. "You're exaggerating. All I'm asking is that you participate." Emily, exhausted and distressed, realized the situation was beyond her control. Fear and anxiety were becoming constants in his life. Mark's behavior was becoming unpredictable and threatening. Emily began to question whether she could continue to deal with the situation and what exactly he was willing to do to maintain his fantasy. Mark's escalating obsession was creating an oppressive and dangerous environment. The line between fantasy and reality was blurring, and Emily felt herself getting closer and closer to a breaking point. As April drew to a close, the atmosphere in the Harris household was filled with tension and uncertainty. Emily found herself in a situation where her options seemed increasingly limited, and Mark's obsession was about to bring events to a tragic and inevitable outcome. The sun was setting in Denver on the evening of April 20th, 2023, casting long, deep shadows on the city's quiet streets. However, inside the Harris home, the atmosphere was far from calm. The tension and fear were at an all-time high, and the events of that night were about to culminate in an inevitable tragedy. Over the past few days, Mark had intensified his demands and begun creating increasingly extreme scenarios for his fantasies. He was obsessed with a new script that involved reenactments of violence and absolute control. Emily, completely uncomfortable and desperate, had tried to refuse, but Mark was determined to push the fantasy to the limit. That night, Mark came up with an elaborate plan that he had called the Grand Final Act. He was determined to create a realistic environment for the set, and the instructions he gave Emily were disturbing. She was supposed to participate in a simulation that involved elements of coercion and submission that left her in a state of panic. Emily, knowing there was no way to change Mark's mind, felt threatened and trapped. She had tried to seek help outside the home, but was scared that Mark might find out. The situation was becoming untenable, and Mark's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable and aggressive. As Mark began to put his plans into action that night, the tension was palpable. He had prepared the environment with meticulous detail, creating an atmosphere that made it seem like fantasy had come true. The house was dark, and the sounds of footsteps and whispers echoed through the hallways, increasing the feeling of fear and oppression. Emily entered the scene with a growing sense of terror. Mark, dressed to resemble an authoritative and controlling figure, began to act out the role he had planned. The situation quickly turned from a fantasy game into something brutal and real. Mark was so immersed in his role that he lost the ability to discern between fantasy and reality. The tension reached a critical point when Mark began acting violently and out of control. He forced Emily to participate in an aggressive manner, and the situation escalated into a physical confrontation. Emily, struggling to defend herself, ended up being seriously injured during the clash. What was supposed to be a fantasy turned into a fight for survival. The screams and chaos inside the house attracted the attention of Emily's friend, Jake, who had noticed the change in Mark's behavior and was concerned for his friend's well-being. Jake decided to go to the Harris house to check out what was going on. When Jake arrived at the house, he found the scene of absolute horror. He entered and found Emily seriously injured, lying on the floor. Mark was standing off to the side, in shock, with the expression of someone who realized what he had done only after the fact. Jake immediately called the police and attempted to provide first aid to Emily. Emergency services arrived quickly, but the injuries were too serious. Emily was pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrested Mark without hesitation. During interrogation, he confessed to the crime with disturbing coldness, detailing how his obsession with fantasies had evolved into violence that he could no longer control. Mark explained that he was so obsessed with his fantasy that he didn't realize the gravity of his actions until it was too late. The case gained prominence in the media, and Emily and Mark Harris's story became a shocking example of the dangers of obsession and control. The local community was horrified by the tragic outcome and the violence that had occurred in a house that appeared normal from the outside. Mark was put on trial and, after a series of testimony and evidence, was convicted of murder. The sentence was harsh, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and the pain caused by the loss of Emily. The Harris's case served as a warning about the hidden dangers of obsessions and how a fantasy, when taken to the extreme, can have devastating consequences. The impact of the tragedy echoed in the lives of those involved and in the community, reminding everyone of the importance of limits and communication within relationships. The end of May brought with it a tense and melancholic atmosphere to Denver. The leaves on the trees were beginning to change color, signaling the arrival of a new cycle, but in the city, the echo of the tragedy continued to resonate, especially for those who had been directly affected by recent events. After the Mark Harris trial, life in Denver was adjusting to a new reality marked by sadness and reflection. The court had concluded the process, and Mark was sentenced to a long prison sentence for first-degree murder. The community was trying to recover from the shock and pain caused by Emily's death, while the details of the case were still discussed and analyzed. Emily Harris had been a beloved presence in her community and a talented artist, and her death left a deep void among friends and family. The pain and confusion were palpable, and many people were still trying to understand how something so terrible could have happened in a relationship that seemed, at first glance, normal and successful. Emily had been a loved and respected figure, and her loss left a trail of grief. The pain was particularly felt by her closest friends, like Jake, who had met Emily that fateful night. Jake was dealing with guilt and anguish over not arriving sooner to prevent the disaster. The post-crime investigation revealed that Mark Harris, during his time in prison, was beginning to show signs of regret and reflection on his actions. His encounters with lawyers and psychologists showed a man entangled in a web of regret and confusion. He was trying to understand how his obsession led him to the point of committing such a horrible crime. While Mark faced the consequences of his actions, the lives of Emily's family and friends tried to find a path to healing. Grief was a painful and slow process. In an attempt to find some kind of closure, Emily's family organized a memorial event in her honor, in which friends, family, and colleagues gathered to celebrate her life and legacy. The event was a space to remember the joy that Emily brought to the lives of those around her. There were displays of her artwork and moving speeches that spoke of her passion and how she had touched everyone's lives. The memorial offered a brief respite from the constant pain and allowed people to share stories and find comfort in each other's company. However, emotional recovery was a complex and ongoing process. The community had to face the collective trauma and deal with the scars left by the tragedy. Mark Harris, now confined in a maximum security penitentiary, faced an uncertain future and a long period of reflection and regret. Time in prison offered Mark the opportunity to confront his actions and deal with the gravity of what he had done. Forensic psychologists and criminologists have reflected on how obsession and fantasy turned into violence. They discussed the warning signs and mechanisms that could have helped prevent the tragedy, offering insights into how the system could improve to identify and address similar problems before they reached a critical point. Emily and Mark Harris's story serves as a reminder of the importance of healthy boundaries in relationships and the need for open and honest communication. The case also highlights the crucial role that psychological understanding and emotional support can play in preventing tragedies. While Denver tried to recover and move forward, the memory of Emily Harris remained alive in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Her life and legacy continue to inspire those who loved her to find strength and resilience in the midst of pain and loss.